Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for having this hearing. And I want to thank you for your years of work on this important issue. I think we all understand that there are many of us that are deeply concerned, and we're grateful to the State Department for your efforts over the years. And I want to especially just recognize the families in the room, that some of you have traveled. I know as a mother, I cannot imagine the pain of what you have gone through, and I want to thank you for continuing to be here and continuing to push for us to resolve these situations, to bring children home to their safely and to their loving families. I was introduced to this issue. I'm new to the issue, but I was introduced to it by my constituent, Jeffrey Morehouse, who has been fighting for the return of his kidnapped son, Mochi, since Father's Day of 2010. And that was the last time that Mr. Morehouse saw or heard from his son. And despite having custody of his son under Washington state law since 2007, a mutual agreement with his ex-wife that she would not travel outside of the state or get a passport, an agreement that the United States is actually Mochi's home country. That was all outlined in this agreement, and the jurisdiction for any custodial dispute. Mochi was still abducted. And Mr. Morehouse even took the preemptive step of notifying all of the Japanese consulates and their embassy in the US in writing that he was the custodial parent, and requested that they deny any request for a passport for Mochi. However, in June of 2010, as you may know, his ex-wife was provided a passport for their son by the Portland consulate, so he went over our state's border into Oregon. He was provided a passport after being denied one by the Seattle consulate, and in 2014 and 2017, Mr. Morehouse then went and actually defended successfully his custodial rights in Japan, where the courts ruled that his US sole custody order is legal in Japan. His ex-wife has twice been denied custody rights under Japanese law, and during proceedings, she admitted to committing passport fraud and forgery in order to abduct Mochi to Japan. Mr. Morehouse is the executive director of Bring Abducted Children Home. He's come to Washington, D.C. over a dozen times on his own case, and the more than 300 U.S. children that have been kidnapped to Japan since 1994, when the Office of Children's Issues was formed. And yet for nearly 8 years, he's been shuttling back and forth between Seattle and Japan, all in vain. And there have been some small victories, but really nothing that has resulted in him actually reuniting with his son. And so I just wanted to follow up on the chairman's questions, and I apologize if you said some of this before I walked in the room, but my understanding is that we have provided in the Goldman Act a number of steps that can be taken. And obviously the first of that is using the diplomatic channels, but there are others, and they go all the way up to formal request to the foreign country to extradite somebody, but there's other things around an official public statement that details the unresolved cases. I guess that's our report. I don't believe we've done a public condemnation in any of these situations, but perhaps you can educate me if we have. And I guess it seems clear to me from reading these, and I'm, as I said, new to the issue, but it seems clear to me that voluntary is not going to produce the results we're looking for. And that we can continue using diplomatic channels, and we should, but we have provided other tools here for the State Department to utilize. And so I'm just wondering what brings this issue to the threshold where, because we've already crossed the thresholds that are outlined in the Goldman Act, as I read it, and so what can you do differently to ensure, for example, that Japan is going to reunite Mr. Morehouse's son? Because my deep concern is that the more these different countries see that the United States is not using the tools, the easier it gets for these countries to continue to just say, well, we'll just work through diplomatic channels, which really means nothing would move forward. And so if you can just help educate me about how you see that, what is the threshold to move from one step to another within the tools that we've given to you? And what can we possibly tell our families about what we're going to do differently than what we've been doing? Because clearly that has not produced the results we're looking for.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Again, with respect to Japan, as the chairman has pointed out, We pursued their accession to the convention. Mr. Morehouse's case is clearly pre-convention. And we have seen a result since they acceded to the convention in terms of a reduction in the number of reported cases and a resolution to the 2014 and beyond cases. We have actually, as a central authority, filed 18 cases with the Japanese Central Authority, and we have had resolution in 14 of those 18 cases. These are convention cases. Most of those have come through this voluntary mediation process. Again, we understand that enforcement of judicial orders is a failure, and it is something that we continue to work on. The Central Authority doesn't have, it seems, the power or authority to make changes that would make enforcements work, which means we've had to ask them to bring other people to the table. We do consider all the tools we have at our disposal, and we do that with our interagency partners and try to use the best tool at the best moment on a case-by-case basis. I hear your concerns about the use of the other tools, and we continue to speak with our interagency partners and the rest of the department who clearly have interests in our bilateral relationships with many of these countries, Japan included, and we know that we have those tools at our disposal and consider them when we think they will be effective.
So what would move the threshold in order to use those tools? I'm still not clear on that, because I understand you're discussing with other agencies, and maybe you could describe that a little bit more. Which are the agencies and departments that you routinely work with, and are there some that have not engaged that need to be engaged? But I'm just trying to understand what would be done differently now that has not been done before, because it's very difficult for us to go back to our constituents who actually have gone through everything that they could possibly go through, both here in the United States and in some cases in the country where their child has been abducted to. What more do we need to do to ensure that you utilize those tools and cross that threshold from just pure diplomatic advocacy? And I just want to echo and recognize the work that you all have done. I think you have made tremendous progress in a number of places, and particularly on those post-convention cases. But I feel like some countries are hiding behind that specific date, and we're not getting resolution.
And again, I think, Congresswoman, that from many countries' point of view, citation in the report would be considered a serious step, and it has resulted in some profound changes in many places. As I said, we wouldn't be able to talk right now about what citations will appear in this upcoming report, but we have had a number of conversations with our Japanese counterparts explaining our frustration with the lack of momentum on enforcement of orders. And in the case of Mr. Morehouse, because I've had the opportunity to meet with him a number of times, we have the characterization of the history of his case is something that we have directly spoken with them about. Again, we do our best to use the tools at our disposal. I don't have a specific answer for you on what the threshold is. We are one voice, one part of the conversation, and I will take back certainly the frustration from members of Congress on not utilizing the full range of tools. And we do feel that we are getting results from a lot of our engagement, certainly from the annual reports, and certainly from the engagement by our chiefs of mission, including Ambassador Hegarty. They are the President's personal representative in that country and the chief of our bilateral relationship with that country. And I think their voice on these issues carries an enormous amount of weight. So we are working in the avenues that we think will produce the best results. And I take on board your point that you believe that there may be results from the use of other tools. At this point, the tools that we have employed and continue to employ have shown some results.
You mentioned earlier that Japanese authorities, I think I wrote this down, Japanese authorities have very limited means to enforce the orders. That seems to me to be, if they're saying that, I think it feels a little, perhaps not fully forthright, that there are many more things that could be done. And it seems to me that if they need to hear that this is critically important to us, that that's where that list of tools, and I don't want to continue to harp on this point, but I just think that at some point we need to move down that list. Otherwise, the act is not really being implemented the way I think the chairman and others had envisioned when we put it into place, because it is working on some, but I think we need to really look at that whole piece. And I hope you hear our frustration in not seeing, particularly on certain cases that have been in process for a long time, not seeing any results there and not having anything to advocate for our children.
Thank you again for that question, and also for expressing that level of dissatisfaction with the progress to date, because it is useful when we sit down and talk about the lack of enforcement. Again, I think when the United States government was pursuing Japan's accession to the convention, we understood that there was quite a gulf in terms of the cultural norms and the way in which Japanese society viewed custody. And we knew that there would be a period of adjustment. When I say law, the Japanese Central Authority or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is limited, and also law enforcement is limited. It's the perspective of how they carry out these kinds of judicial decisions. And we have spoken about that, and I think the chairman referred to a letter earlier that a number of the EU countries sent. Again, there's nothing in existence, even in their domestic law, about these kinds of enforcements of judicial decisions with respect to custody that are useful at this moment. And that's why, we continue to implore them to look at ways to put into place domestic legislation that would also have an effect on these international cases. And it's something that we continue to talk about and raise at every opportunity. So thank you again for sharing your perspective with me and your frustration on that level. It is helpful when we are talking to our counterparts to explain that this is felt throughout the U.S. government, and it is on behalf of our citizens and your constituents that we bring these matters to their attention and ask that they do something to resolve the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Jayapal, let me just note for the record, and I know you know this, Jeffrey Morehouse has done it by the book. He is so disciplined, like so many of the left behind parents, dotting every I, crossing every T. He testified in May of 2015 before our subcommittee. Very, very comprehensive testimony. He remains, so thank you for raising his case. The idea, and I'll go to Dr. Harris in 2 seconds, as you may know, I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That has sanctions in it. When Israel and South Korea, two of our closest allies, were deemed to be Tier 3 egregious violators on human trafficking, they were worried about security assistance and other assistance, but particularly security assistance, being limited in some way. They changed their laws. They enforced, in the case of Israel, existing law, and they shut down the brothels and came into compliance within 1 year. Sanctions work. And if Japan, doesn't get it through your persuasion, and I thank you for trying so hard, it is time to lower the boom, please, with respect, and say you have failed utterly. These longer-term cases are egregious. These families are broken, and security assistance, as you know, in the Goldman Act is one of those sanctions that can be levied